Oi, fuck Roy Cohn.
Fuck Roy Cohn.
Fuck Roy Cohn.
Fuck Roy Cohn.
Fuck Roy Cohn. Oh yeah.
Welcome back, everybody, to I Hate Roy Cohn, and so should you. How Roy Cohn ruined the world. Today we're going to talk about phantom promises. No tax on overtime. It's 5 words, gang, and it creates an image instantly. Now the audience fills in the blanks themselves. They imagine tax-free overtime, basically more money and a bigger paycheck. A reward for hard work. The slogan did all the work. The legislation barely mattered. See, Roy Cohn loved that kind of asymmetry. Because once the emotional picture exists, facts have to fight uphill. Now, someone has to explain tax deductions, marginal rates, overtime premiums, statutory caps, and IRS guidance. One side uses 5 words. The other side needs 5 minutes. That's not an accident. That is the strategy. See, the Roy Cohn style inversion is, instead of asking, how do we write better policy, the question becomes, how do we create a better headline? Now, the headline becomes reality and the policy becomes fine print. That's exactly how phantom promises work. The left has the problem where we can't just seem to explain anything without going into the minutia of it. And that's one of the reasons why Mamdani has become so popular, because he says everybody should deserve to be able to live well. And everybody can understand that. And it doesn't take long to say. Now, something fascinating happens, gang, when reality begins arriving, one receipt at a time. The grocery bill, the utility bill, the insurance premium even, the gas pump and the pharmacy, lastly the mortgage payment and the rent. Every receipt quietly asks the same question. Did the slogan survive contact with arithmetic? Because that's the audit. Not cable news, not campaign rallies. Reality. And reality is where Roy Cohn's strategy becomes difficult to maintain. Because receipts accumulate. Not all at once, but slowly, month after month. The deduction may exist, but so do the grocery receipts. The deduction may be real, but so is the insurance premium. The deduction may be technically true, but purchasing power is also true. And this is why reality is so dangerous to propaganda, is because reality keeps records. And that's where Roy Cohn's second rule. It matters just as much as the first. Never admit error. Never concede the premise. If the public doesn't feel richer, change the conversation. If the grocery bill is higher, talk about patriotism. If housing is more expensive, talk about enemies. If healthcare costs rise, talk about immigrants. And if wages stagnate, talk about communists or Marxists. Never allow the conversation to remain on measurable outcomes, because measurable outcomes actually produce receipts, and receipts produce accountability, and accountability destroys mythology. Watch the Jack Smith interview that just took place. He had all of the receipts. Unfortunately, since Bone Spurs got elected, none of those mattered. I think we need to make him Attorney General personally. See, that's the new purpose of the Red Scare, gang, is not simply to create fear, but to interrupt arithmetic. Because arithmetic is politically devastating. People eventually compare promises to bank statements, campaign speeches, to their grocery bill, economic rhetoric, economic rhetoric doesn't pay the rent. And once people begin performing those calculations, the spell begins to weaken. Which brings us back to the breach. We spoke about this already. Because the breach isn't merely progressive electoral victory, it's the moment people begin trusting receipts more than rhetoric. It's the moment lived experience overtakes narrative, and it's when a voter says, wait a minute, this isn't what I was promised. In the Roy Cohn worldview, that realization itself is dangerous, because once people start auditing power instead of applauding it, authority loses control of the story. And you can see throughout history, every time that an authoritarian lost control of the plot, when the lies no longer work, then came the crackdown, because the mask is off. I always love how members of MAGA and members of, for example, in the German political sphere, the AfD, they always say things like, people say that we're bigots and we're Nazis, but we're not Nazis and we're not bigots. But then Megyn Kelly gets a chance to take the mask off, gives the game away completely. So does Tom Emmer. And then I had the joy myself yesterday of one-on-one debating a Nazi on the sidewalk. And as they brought the AfD talking points, I brought the receipts. And I've learned two things. Number one, people are extremely influenced by places like Instagram and TikTok because the idea of checking receipts doesn't even show up. And secondly, most Nazis they just need a friend that doesn't suck. This is why I think the breach is such an important framing device, because it's not just about elections. It's about what happens when reality begins to outrank propaganda and when the ledger becomes more persuasive than the slogan. When one receipt at a time, the phantom promise dissolves. That's one of the reasons that it's so hard for the left to gain power, because we go off of receipts and facts, but we have to wait for those to pile up. We can't just make shit up. Because then when the receipts come, we don't just obfuscate and use the Roy Cohn playbook. We're all of a sudden stuck with needing to provide an account for what we said. So that's why it takes time. Because in the end, Roy Cohn's greatest lesson wasn't how to win an argument, gang. It was how to delay the audit. Every distraction, every scapegoat, every culture war, every red scare, or every manufactured emergency, it just buys one more day before someone asks the only question that actually matters: am I actually better off? And that's the question that Roy Cohn's playbook never wants the public to answer for themselves. Because there's an old saying in accounting, the ledger doesn't care how confident you are. It doesn't care how loud you spoke, and it certainly doesn't care how many applause lines you received. It only records what actually happened, and that's why authoritarian politics has always had a complicated relationship with paperwork, because paperwork remembers. Authoritarians also hate journalists because they bring the receipts. The media is the enemy of the people is repeated consistently in every fascist regime because the receipts come with journalism. See, let's go ahead and use an example. Let's take Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, for example. See, she walked into this one hearing and she was carrying something almost revolutionary. Not outrage, not slogans or partisan branding. Receipts, literal reports, budget figures, historical records, documentation. Notice what she keeps saying? I'd like to enter this into the record. You see, again and again and again. Watch the clip. Over and over and over. And that phrase is doing far more work than most people realize. She's moving the discussion away from performance and towards evidence. Away from personalities and towards documentation, and away from narrative and towards the ledger. That is an extraordinarily dangerous place for propaganda to live, and Roy Cohn understood something that has become foundational to modern political communication. Facts are slow, emotion is fast. And documentation requires attention, and branding requires only recognition. The longer someone spends examining evidence, the less time they're reacting emotionally. That's why the first impression matters so much. Because once the emotional picture exists, every correction has to literally climb uphill. Now, if you watch what happened in that hearing, Crockett isn't simply criticizing Republicans, she's auditing them. Those are two completely different activities, gang. She begins with debt, not opinions about debt, documented debt, articles, budget estimates, historical comparisons, and then she pivots. Who controls the White House? Well, that answers Republicans. Who controls the Senate? Same. And who controls the House? Hey, let me give you a guess. It's Republicans. Now, does Iowa function under Republican control? Yes. Excellent. How responsibility has an address. See, notice what just disappeared. The excuse. Before assigning responsibility, she establishes authority. Who actually has the power? Who actually controls the machinery? And once those questions are answered, well, the conversation changes. It's no longer who should we blame. Now the question is, who's already in charge? That, gang, is accountability. Then she does something even more interesting. She begins talking about ethics, treasurers, and oversight, institutional responsibilities, even constitutional duties. Again, not emotional arguments, structural arguments. She reminds everyone that democratic institutions were intentionally designed so that no single individual simply becomes the government. That's the way our Constitution works. Government's supposed to be boring. Politics was supposed to be boring, not this WWE shit. It's supposed to be procedural and documented, accountable, because accountability leaves paper trails. And once more, that's where Roy Cohn enters our story. Because his genius wasn't merely attacking opponents, it was changing the battlefield. Don't argue the spreadsheet, attack the accountant. Don't explain the budget. Question the patriotism of the person reading it. Don't answer oversight. Declare oversight to be persecution. Never let the conversation remain on measurable outcomes. Because measurable outcomes, well, they produce receipts. And receipts produce accountability, and accountability produces consequences. Do you see how this works? Because the genius of Roy Cohn wasn't in the law, it was in the communication strategy. He understood the fundamental asymmetry of the human mind. You don't have to win the policy, you only have to win the first impression. Let's take a slogan like we did at the very beginning: no tax on overtime. In 5 words, it creates an instantaneous emotional image. Now, the worker doesn't see a legislative draft, they imagine a bigger paycheck and a reward for their hard work. The slogan does all the heavy lifting, leaving the actual legislation to be treated as mere fine print. And once that emotional picture is locked in, well, the facts, they have to fight an uphill battle. Because to debunk a 5-word slogan, an opponent needs 5 minutes of boring explanations about marginal rates, statutory caps, and IRS guidance, and that gap, that space between the simple feeling of a complex truth, well, that's where the Roy Cohn inversion lives. The question is no longer how do we write better policy, it's how do we create a better headline, and then, reality begins to arrive one receipt at a time. Every single receipt asks the same question: did the slogan survive the contact with the arithmetic? This is the only place where propaganda fails, because reality does keep the records, gang. Like I said earlier, if the public doesn't feel richer, change the conversation. If the grocery bill's higher, talk about patriotism. If the housing's more expensive, find an enemy. If wages stagnate, scream communist and Marxist. You move the goalposts of the conversation away from measurable outcomes, because measurable outcomes produce receipts, and receipts produce accountability. This is the true purpose of the New Red Scare, gang. It's not just about creating fear, it's about interrupting the arithmetic. It's a calculated effort to stop people from comparing campaign speeches to their bank statements. When a voter finally asks, hey, wait a minute, this wasn't what I was promised, they've reached the breach. And the breach isn't just that progressive electoral victory, gang. It is the moment that lived experience outranks the narrative. And the moment that the ledger becomes more persuasive than the slogans, Roy Cohn's greatest lesson wasn't how to win an argument, but how to delay the audit. And every manufacturing emergency and cultural war is just simply a way to buy one more day. You know, I mean, they can just scream a line and then it's up to you to debunk it, and that takes too much time. Because the audit doesn't happen in a boardroom or a polling station. It happens at 3 a.m. when the heating kicks off and the bank sends a certified letter. And for millions, the Roy Cohn inversion is no longer a political theory. It's a physical sensation of cold. They were told that their struggle was a badge of honor in a war against the deep state, and that the rubble around them was just a necessary demolition before the grand reconstruction. But as the months turn into years, the cognitive dissonance begins to fray. They find themselves in a very precarious position, actually, come to think of it. I mean, think about it, gang. They're the foot soldiers of a movement that views their actual suffering as tactical convenience. This is the most dangerous moment for the architect of the narrative, is when the vibe of the strength, well, it fails to pay the rent. And the gap between the slogan and the receipt, that becomes a chasm. And to close that chasm, the machine cannot just offer a policy fix, because the policy was always a phantom. It's a fucking lie, and instead it must accelerate the Red Scare. It must find a more vivid, more terrifying enemy to distract the foot soldier from the notice in his hand. Now see, the focus needs to shift from why is my house gone to who is the communist trying to steal the rest of it. The pivot is a surgical operation. Into the Roy Cohn style mind, a failure is simply success that hasn't been rebranded yet. So when the phantom promise of affordable housing finally collapsed, the administration didn't apologize for the displacement. They rebranded the empty lots as strategic urban reserves. They told the displaced family that the delay wasn't a failure of capitalism, but a necessary defense against socialist infiltration. That it allegedly sabotaged the zoning boards. And by transforming a corporate failure into a security crisis, they managed to keep the foot soldiers fighting a ghost, while the developers cashed out their remaining subsidies. And this, gang, is where the rubble and the rot becomes a permanent feature of our landscape. See, the movement doesn't want to build a city. It wants to maintain a state of perpetual construction. Like, think about like a horizon of like coming soon signs that act as a psychological carrot for the desperate. Like, as long as the promised utopia is just one more purge of the deep state away, the supporter will still tolerate the cold in their apartment and the hunger in their stomach. The genius of the strategy is that it replaces the tangible need for a roof with the intangible desire for a victory. Not to mention, some people, they just need to be the victim in order to have a personality. And then there's people who are just sadists and they enjoy cruelty. So it doesn't matter if they're doing bad. If the people that they don't like are doing worse, that's all that matters. I like to say some people will shit their own pants just to make you smell it. This is exactly why I keep talking about the phantom promise as a slogan. It asks you to imagine, and a receipt asks you to calculate. See, those are completely different experiences, gang, because a politician says no tax on overtime, and a taxpayer eventually looks at their pay stub. A politician says the economy's booming, and a family looks at their grocery receipt. When they say that we're reducing your costs, well, insurance renewal arrives in the mail, and so does healthcare. Reality performs the audit itself, not cable news, not social media, but reality. That's why receipts are so politically dangerous, because they don't argue, they accumulate. One grocery bill, one utility bill, an insurance premium, a budget report, debt projection, committee transcript, one executive order. None of them are particularly dramatic, but together they become a very difficult thing to ignore, because propaganda survives by keeping every receipt isolated. Reality wins by stacking them together. One of the reasons that I started this podcast was to get people to understand how they can use receipts to debunk not just propaganda, but talking points as well. striving for a way that people can begin using media literacy every single time that they see it pop up in front of their news feed, or they see it on Instagram, they see anybody using the Roy Cohn playbook. I want them to be able to point their finger and say, there it is right there. He's attacking the evidence. Because this is right here. This is where the breach begins to make sense, because the breach isn't simply an election. It isn't merely a progressive victory, and it isn't even fundamentally about politics. The breach occurs the moment that people begin trusting their lived experience more than slogans. You know what I mean? Like the moment that they compare the campaign promise to the ledger. And that question terrifies every authoritarian movement in history. Because when they ask what actually happened versus what was promised, no movement can indefinitely survive an honest audit. And this is why Roy Cohn's strategy never ends with one lie, or one slogan, or one distraction, or one accusation. It can't. Because receipts accumulate. And the only solution is another headline, or another outrage, another emergency, another enemy, another culture war. Anything. Just anything to prevent the public from performing actual arithmetic. Because arithmetic has no ideology and math doesn't vote. I mean, think about it. Ledgers don't have political parties, gang. The grocery receipt doesn't give a fuck what cable channel you watch. It simply records what's left in your checking account. Let's swing back to why this is why Jasmine Crockett's hearing matters. Not because everybody agreed with her conclusions, and not because one hearing changes history, but because she repeatedly forced the conversation back towards the documentation, towards records and institutional memory and evidence. She wasn't asking the public to trust her. She was asking the public to inspect their paperwork, and that, my friends, is democracy at its healthiest. Not blind trust, but public audit. You know, I mean, that is why I built this series around one simple phrase: present your evidence. Not because evidence always wins immediately, it usually doesn't. And Roy Cohn understood that. But evidence has one remarkable quality, is that it survives after the speeches and the headlines disappear and the campaign slogans fade. They remain. And every society reaches the same unavoidable question, not who gave the better speech or who won the news cycle, or not who sounded strongest, only this: what does the ledger say? Because in the end, power can manipulate perception, and power can manufacture outrage. Power can even redefine reality for a little while, but it cannot negotiate with arithmetic, and eventually the receipts always balance the books. Present your evidence, and as always, remember, gang, fuck Roy Cohn.
Go to skipfranzjr.net for podcasts.
Record player that I could just spin records all the time.
Run into the bathroom and I'm covered in blood. Like I had put my tooth through my bottom lip.
For music. For gaming and pro-liberty game rants. That's skipfranzjr.net.
Oi, fuck Roy Cohn.
Fuck Roy Cohn.
Fuck Roy Cohn.
Fuck Roy Cohn. Fuck Roy Cohn.